guilty of witchcraft. The sentence is death by hanging. In the winter of 1692, in a small Puritan village in Massachusetts, a few young girls began having strange fits, convulsing, screaming, claiming they were being tormented by invisible forces. Within months, this unexplained outbreak would spiral into one of the darkest chapters in American history, claiming 25 lives and tearing apart an entire community in an explosion of fear, suspicion, and religious hysteria that would echo through the centuries. But here's what will shock you. The Salem Witch Trials were never really about witchcraft at all. Behind the accusations of supernatural evil lay a complex web of social tensions, political rivalries, economic disputes, and psychological factors that transformed ordinary neighbors into accusers and victims in a tragedy that reveals disturbing truths about human nature, mass hysteria, and the dangerous power of fear to destroy rational thought and moral judgment. Welcome to History Unleashed, where we uncover the truth behind history's most compelling mysteries and darkest moments. I'm your host, and today we're investigating the Salem Witch Trials, not as a simple story of superstition and hysteria, but as a complex historical event that exposes the fault lines in Puritan society and offers chilling insights into how quickly civilization can collapse when fear overwhelms reason. If you're ready to discover the real story behind one of America's most infamous tragedies, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what we're about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about Salem, witchcraft accusations, and the fragile nature of justice itself. Trust me, by the end of this investigation, you'll understand why the Salem Witch Trials remain relevant as a warning about the dangers of mass hysteria and the importance of protecting individual rights against mob rule. So prepare yourself for a journey into the heart of darkness that consumed a Puritan community and created a legacy of shame that haunts American history to this day. The Salem Witch Trials of 1692 cannot be understood without first examining the unique and volatile social conditions that existed in late 17th century Massachusetts Bay Colony, where Puritan religious ideology, frontier dangers, political instability, and economic pressures had created a community primed for explosion. The village of Salem was not the peaceful, devout settlement that many imagine, but rather a deeply divided community struggling with internal conflicts that would provide the perfect breeding ground for the hysteria that was about to consume it. The Puritan worldview that dominated Massachusetts Bay Colony was fundamentally different from modern concepts of religious tolerance and separation of church and state, as these English Protestant settlers had fled their homeland to establish a city upon a hill and a perfect Christian community that would serve as an example to the world of how society should be organized according to strict biblical principles. This idealistic vision created enormous psychological pressure on community members to maintain perfect moral conduct while also establishing rigid social hierarchies and behavioral expectations that left little room for individual expression or dissent. The theological framework of Puritan belief included absolute acceptance of the reality of supernatural forces, both divine and demonic, operating constantly in the material world and influencing human affairs in ways that required constant vigilance and spiritual warfare. Puritans believed that Satan was actively working to corrupt their holy experiment, using witches and other agents to infiltrate their communities and destroy their covenant with God, making accusations of witchcraft not only plausible but almost inevitable when unexplained misfortunes or strange behaviors occurred. The social structure of Salem Village in 1692 was characterized by deep divisions and long-standing grievances that had been building for decades, creating fault lines along which the community would eventually fracture when the witch trials began. The village was split between those who supported the independent status of Salem Village and those who preferred continued subordination to the larger and more prosperous Salem town, a dispute that involved not only civic pride but substantial economic interests related to taxation, land ownership, and political control. The economic tensions within Salem Village reflected broader patterns of social change occurring throughout New England as the original Puritan settlements evolved from struggling frontier communities into more complex and stratified societies with growing wealth disparities and competing interest groups. The Porter family and their allies represented the emerging merchant class that favored closer ties with Salem town and participation in Atlantic trade, while the Putnam family and their Supporters championed traditional agricultural values and village independence. These family rivalries had deep, historical roots stretching back decades and involved disputes over land boundaries, ministerial appointments, taxation policies, and political representation that had created lasting resentments and competing power structures within the small community. The personal animosities between leading families would prove crucial in determining who was accused of witchcraft and who served as accusers when the trials began, revealing how supernatural fears could be weaponized to settle mundane social and economic disputes. The political context of the Salem Witch Trials was equally important, as Massachusetts Bay Colony was experiencing a crisis of governmental authority following the revocation of its original charter by the English Crown and its temporary incorporation into the Dominion of New England under the unpopular rule of Governor Edmund Andros. The overthrow of Andros in 1689 had left the colony in legal limbo, operating under temporary arrangements while waiting for a new charter that would define its governmental structure and relationship to royal authority. Here's something that reveals how political instability can contribute to social breakdown. From which country are you watching this? Because history shows us repeatedly that communities under political stress often turn to scapegoating and internal conflict when they feel powerless to address larger problems. What examples can you think of from your region where political uncertainty led to social tensions or persecution of minority groups? Share your insights in the comments. The appointment of Sir William Phips as the new royal governor in May 1692 came at the height of the witch trial crisis and reflected the Crown's attempt to restore stable government while also maintaining royal control over the increasingly independent-minded colonists. Phips brought with him the new charter that officially established Massachusetts as a royal colony with greater religious tolerance and broader political participation than the original Puritan theocracy had allowed, changes that threatened traditional power structures and created additional anxiety among conservative elements of society. The military pressures facing Massachusetts Bay Colony also contributed to the atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that made witch accusations more credible, as ongoing conflicts with French and Native American forces on the northern frontier had created a constant sense of external threat and divine judgment. The recent devastating attacks on settlements like York, Wells, and Salmon Falls had killed hundreds of colonists and left survivors with traumatic memories and fears about their community's vulnerability to supernatural as well as earthly enemies. The religious leadership crisis in Salem Village had created additional instability and conflict in the years leading up to the witch trials, as the community had struggled to find and retain qualified ministers who could navigate the political divisions and personal animosities that characterized village life. The controversial tenure of Reverend Samuel Parris, who arrived in 1689 and immediately became embroiled in disputes over his salary, housing, and authority, had further polarized the community and created new sources of resentment and mistrust. Parris's background as a former merchant in the Caribbean had made him suspect to some villagers who questioned his qualifications and motivations for entering the ministry, while his rigid theological views and authoritarian leadership style had alienated others who preferred more moderate approaches to religious and community governance. His household would become the epicenter of the witchcraft outbreak when his daughter and niece began experiencing the strange fits that would trigger the entire crisis. The demographic pressures affecting Salem Village included rapid population growth, increasing economic stratification, and generational tensions between older settlers who had established the community's original institutions and younger people who were finding fewer opportunities for land ownership and economic advancement within the traditional social structure. These pressures created competition for scarce resources and social positions that made community members more susceptible to conflicts that could escalate into serious accusations and lasting grudges. The intellectual and cultural context of the Salem witch trials reflected the broader transition from medieval to modern ways of understanding the world, as traditional beliefs in supernatural causation and divine intervention were beginning to compete with emerging scientific and rational explanations for natural phenomena. However, this transition was incomplete and uneven, leaving many colonists caught between conflicting worldviews and uncertain about how to interpret unusual events or unexplained occurrences in their daily lives. The legal framework that would govern the witch trials was based on English common law traditions that recognized witchcraft as a capital crime while also establishing evidentiary standards that theoretically protected accused persons from false conviction. However, the practical application of these legal principles in the highly charged atmosphere of 1692 Salem would prove inadequate to prevent the judicial disasters that were about to unfold, as fear and political pressure would override careful legal procedure and rational evaluation of evidence. Chapter 2. The Afflicted Girls. The Salem Witch Trials began not with accusations of witchcraft, but with the mysterious illness that struck several young girls in Salem Village during the winter of 1691 and 1692, creating a medical and psychological puzzle that would baffle contemporary observers and continue to challenge historians and medical experts over 3 centuries later. The strange behaviors exhibited by these girls, violent fits, contorted postures, incomprehensible speech, and claims of being tormented by invisible attackers defied conventional explanation and would ultimately be interpreted through the lens of supernatural belief that dominated Puritan culture. The first signs of the mysterious affliction appeared in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, where his 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began displaying erratic behavior that initially concerned their family, but did not immediately suggest supernatural causes. The girls complained of pinching and pricking sensations, experienced periods of speechlessness, and sometimes fell into trance-like states that seemed to remove them temporarily from normal consciousness and social interaction. As the unusual symptoms persisted and intensified, the Parris household consulted local physicians, including Dr. William Griggs, who examined the girls but found no physical explanation for their condition. The failure of conventional medical treatment to provide relief or diagnosis gradually led the family and community to consider supernatural explanations, particularly when the girls' symptoms began to include behaviors that seemed to demonstrate knowledge or abilities beyond what their age and education should have provided. The involvement of Tituba, an enslaved woman of possible Caribbean or Native American origin who served in the Parris household, would prove crucial to the development of the witchcraft narrative that emerged from the girls' mysterious illness. Tituba's cultural background included knowledge of folk magic and healing practices that were foreign to Puritan tradition, but that may have been employed in attempts to help the afflicted girls, creating associations between their condition and supernatural practices that would later be used to support witchcraft accusations. The spread of the affliction to other young people in Salem Village, including Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard, transformed what had initially appeared to be an isolated medical mystery into a community crisis that demanded explanation and action. The fact that multiple unrelated individuals were experiencing similar symptoms suggested either a contagious condition or a supernatural cause that affected the entire community rather than just one family. The symptoms displayed by the afflicted girls were dramatic and disturbing, including violent convulsions, contorted body positions that seemed to defy normal anatomy, periods of apparent blindness and deafness, and vocalizations that witnesses interpreted as either supernatural communication or evidence of demonic possession. These physical manifestations were accompanied by claims that invisible attackers were biting, pinching, and otherwise tormenting them in ways that left no visible evidence but caused apparent real suffering. The psychological dimensions of the girls' behavior included what appeared to be selective symptoms that occurred primarily when community attention was focused on them, suggesting either conscious or unconscious performance elements that complicated attempts to determine whether their suffering was genuine medical condition, deliberate deception, or some combination of both factors. The girls demonstrated an uncanny ability to identify supposed witches and describe their supernatural activities in detail, claiming special insight into the invisible world that was tormenting them. Here's something that shows how mysterious illnesses can become social phenomena. From which country are you watching this? Because throughout history, unexplained medical conditions affecting groups of people, especially young people, have often been interpreted through cultural and religious frameworks rather than medical ones. What examples can you think of from your region where collective illness or strange behavior was attributed to supernatural or social causes? Share your observations in the comments. The social dynamics surrounding the afflicted girls reveal important insights into power relationships and attention-seeking behaviors within Puritan society. As these young people suddenly found themselves at the center of community attention and adult concern, in ways that were unprecedented in their normal social experience. The girls' accusations carried enormous weight with adult authorities, giving them temporary but significant power to influence community decisions and interpersonal relationships. The expanding circle of accusations that emanated from the afflicted girls followed patterns that reflected existing social tensions and personal conflicts within Salem Village, suggesting that their supernatural insights were influenced by community gossip, family loyalties, and long-standing grudges that had been building for years before the witchcraft crisis began. The first accused individuals, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne, were all marginal community members who lacked strong social support or political protection. The interrogation techniques used with the afflicted girls during preliminary examinations and formal trials created opportunities for their symptoms to be reinforced and elaborated. Through leading questions, social pressure, and the dramatic courtroom environment that rewarded spectacular displays of supernatural torment, the legal proceedings themselves became theatrical events that encouraged increasingly elaborate performances from both accusers and accused. The role of adult authorities in shaping the girls' testimony reveals how community expectations and leading questions could influence the development of their stories about supernatural persecution, as magistrates, ministers, and family members all had vested interests in particular interpretations of the girls' experiences that would support their own beliefs about witchcraft and community threats. The adults' validation of the girls' claims gave them incentive to continue and expand their accusations. The medical interpretations of the afflicted girls' condition that have been proposed by modern scholars include various forms of psychological disorder, neurological conditions, food poisoning from ergot-contaminated grain, and deliberate deception motivated by attention-seeking or malicious intent. Each of these explanations has supporting evidence but also significant limitations that prevent definitive diagnosis of a phenomenon that occurred over 3 centuries ago under very different medical and cultural circumstances. The cultural context of female adolescence in Puritan society provides important background for understanding why young women became the primary accusers in the Salem Witch Trials, as this demographic group faced particular pressures and limitations that may have created psychological conditions conducive to the behaviors associated with supernatural affliction. Young women in Puritan society had very limited opportunities for legitimate power or public attention, making the dramatic possibilities offered by witchcraft accusations particularly appealing. The religious significance attributed to the girls' experiences by Puritan authorities reflected theological beliefs about spiritual warfare and the particular vulnerability of innocent young people to demonic attack, which made their testimony especially credible to community members who viewed the afflictions as evidence of Satan's assault on their godly community. The girls were simultaneously seen as victims deserving protection and as weapons in the fight against supernatural evil. The long-term psychological impact of their involvement in the witch trials on the surviving afflicted girls remains largely unknown, as few detailed records exist of their later lives and experiences. Some eventually recanted their testimony or expressed regret about their role in the proceedings, while others maintained their claims throughout their lives, suggesting varying levels of genuine belief in their own supernatural experiences versus conscious participation in deception or community drama. The transformation of the Salem girls' mysterious afflictions into specific accusations of witchcraft marked a crucial turning point that would determine the scope and direction of the crisis that was about to engulf the entire community. The process by which general claims of supernatural torment became focused accusations against particular individuals reveals the complex social and psychological mechanisms that drive witch-hunting phenomena and demonstrates how personal grievances and community tensions could be channeled through beliefs about supernatural evil to devastating effect. The first 3 women accused of witchcraft, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne, represented different aspects of social marginality and vulnerability that made them obvious targets for community suspicion while also reflecting the specific dynamics of power and prejudice that characterized Salem Village society. Each of these women occupied positions that placed them outside the protection of respectable social networks while also making them convenient scapegoats for community fears and anxieties about supernatural threats. Tituba's status as an enslaved person of non-European origin made her doubly vulnerable to witchcraft accusations, as racial prejudice and assumptions about the supernatural knowledge possessed by people from Caribbean and Native American cultures made her seem both likely to practice witchcraft and dangerous to community safety. Her intimate position within the Paris household, where the initial afflictions had occurred, provided additional circumstantial evidence that could be interpreted as proof of her malevolent supernatural activities against the minister's family. Sarah Good embodied another category of social vulnerability that made witchcraft accusations probable, as her status as a homeless beggar who survived through community charity and occasional menial work placed her in constant conflict with neighbors who resented her demands for assistance while also fearing her potential for revenge when help was refused. Good's reputation for muttering curses and making threatening statements when denied charity had created a community perception of her as malevolent and potentially dangerous. Sarah Osborne's case demonstrated how property disputes and family conflicts could intersect with witchcraft accusations, as her ongoing legal battles over her deceased husband's estate had created enemies who had material interests in discrediting her character and removing her from the community. Her irregular relationship with her indentured servant and her failure to attend church regularly had also made her suspect to neighbors, who viewed such behaviors as evidence of moral corruption that could lead to supernatural evil. The preliminary examination of these three accused women on March 1, 1692, established the procedural patterns and evidentiary standards that would characterize all subsequent witch trials in Salem, creating precedents that would prove crucial to the expansion of accusations and the ultimate scope of the crisis. The examination was conducted by local magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, whose approach to questioning revealed assumptions about guilt and supernatural causation that prevented fair evaluation of the evidence. The dramatic courtroom scenes that occurred during the preliminary examinations created a theatrical environment that reinforced beliefs about supernatural conflict while also providing entertainment and emotional release for community members who had been living under increasing tension and fear. The afflicted girls' spectacular displays of torment, supposedly caused by the mere presence of the accused witches, provided seemingly objective evidence of supernatural activity that was difficult for observers to dismiss or explain through natural causes. Tituba's confession during her examination represented a crucial turning point that validated the reality of witchcraft in Salem, while also expanding the scope of suspected supernatural activity beyond the original three accused individuals. Her detailed descriptions of meetings with the devil, supernatural creatures, and other witches provided a narrative framework that made additional accusations seem logical and necessary to protect the community from an extensive conspiracy of supernatural evil. The content of Tituba's confession reflected a complex mixture of Caribbean and Native American folk beliefs, Christian theological concepts, and details that may have been suggested by her interrogators' leading questions, creating a supernatural narrative that seemed exotic and frightening to Puritan audiences, while also confirming their existing beliefs about the reality and danger of witchcraft. Her admission that other witches were operating in the community made further accusations inevitable. Here's something that shows how confessions under pressure can expand persecution. From which country are you watching this? Because throughout history, forced confessions have often led to wider persecution as authorities use initial admissions to justify hunting for accomplices and co-conspirators. What examples can you think of from your region where one confession led to broader investigations or persecution? Share your thoughts in the comments. The community response to the first accusations and examinations revealed how quickly fear and suspicion could spread once the initial barriers to supernatural explanation had been broken down by official validation and spectacular evidence. Community members who had previously attributed misfortunes to natural causes began reinterpreting past events as evidence of witchcraft, creating an expanding web of suspicion that would eventually encompass dozens of individuals across multiple communities. The role of testimony from the afflicted girls in the preliminary examinations established their unique authority as supernatural witnesses, whose claims carried more weight than normal legal evidence creating a judicial process that elevated spectral evidence and supernatural claims over conventional standards of proof, based on physical evidence and reliable witness testimony. This departure from normal legal procedure would prove crucial to the expansion and ultimate injustice of the Salem trials. The social networks activated by the first accusations reveal how family relationships, economic partnerships, and political alliances influenced both who was accused and who served as accusers in the developing witch trial crisis. The Putnam family's central role in supporting the afflicted girls and pursuing witchcraft prosecutions reflected their long-standing conflicts with other community factions, while also demonstrating how supernatural fears could be used to advance secular political and economic interests. The geographic expansion of accusations beyond Salem Village to include residents of Salem Town, Andover, and other neighboring communities showed how the witch-hunting phenomenon could spread rapidly once it gained momentum and official support. The inclusion of accused individuals from different communities also revealed how local conflicts and grievances could be channeled through the witchcraft prosecution system to settle disputes that might otherwise have required civil legal procedures. The economic dimensions of the first accusations were reflected in the social, class, and property ownership patterns of both accusers and accused, with wealthy and well-connected individuals generally serving as accusers while poor, marginal, or politically vulnerable people became targets of supernatural suspicion. These patterns suggest that witchcraft accusations served functions related to social control and resource competition that extended far beyond genuine beliefs about supernatural evil. The religious authority invoked to support the first accusations came from local ministers and theologians who provided scriptural and theological justification for the reality of witchcraft and the necessity of aggressive prosecution to protect the community from supernatural threat. The involvement of respected religious leaders gave the witch trials legitimacy and moral authority that made opposition difficult and dangerous for community members who might have questioned the proceedings. The psychological mechanisms that drove the first accusations included projection of community anxieties onto convenient scapegoats, displacement of anger about political and economic problems onto supernatural explanations, and the satisfaction of revenge motives through socially acceptable channels that allowed accusers to harm their enemies while claiming to serve community protection and divine justice. The formal beginning of the Salem Witch Trials in May 1692 marked the transition from preliminary examinations and local investigations to a systematic judicial process that would ultimately claim the lives of 20 people while demonstrating the catastrophic consequences that could result when legal institutions abandoned rational procedures in favor of supernatural explanations and spectral evidence. The establishment of the Court of Oyer and Terminer by Governor William Phipps represented an attempt to bring order to the chaotic situation in Salem, while also legitimizing the prosecution of witchcraft cases under royal authority. The appointment of William Stoughton as Chief Justice of the Special Court reflected the colonial government's decision to place the witch trials under the authority of respected legal and political figures who possessed both the knowledge and the determination necessary to conduct effective prosecutions against supernatural criminals. Stoughton's background as a former minister turned politician gave him credibility with both religious and secular authorities while also ensuring that the court would take a firm stance against witchcraft and related supernatural crimes. The legal framework established for the Salem Witch Trials incorporated traditional English common law approaches to witchcraft prosecution while also adapting to the specific circumstances and evidence types that characterized the Massachusetts cases. The court's acceptance of spectral evidence, testimony about supernatural appearances, and actions that could only be perceived by specially afflicted witnesses represented a crucial departure from normal evidentiary standards that would prove central to the trial's ultimate injustice and tragedy. The first case heard by the Court of Oyer and Terminer involved Bridget Bishop, a Salem town tavern keeper whose unconventional lifestyle and previous involvement in legal disputes had made her a target of community suspicion even before the 1692 witchcraft crisis began. Bishop's case established important precedents for evidence, procedure, and punishment that would influence all subsequent trials while also demonstrating how previous reputation and social position could determine the outcome of witchcraft Prosecutions. The evidence presented against Bridget Bishop included testimony from the afflicted girls about supernatural torments, witness accounts of strange behavior and unexplained incidents, and physical evidence in the form of puppets or magical dolls allegedly found in her house that were interpreted as tools for supernatural harm. The combination of spectral evidence, circumstantial evidence, and physical evidence created a seemingly compelling case that satisfied both legal requirements and popular expectations about witchcraft prosecution. The trial procedures used in Bishop's case and subsequent prosecutions reflected the court's attempt to maintain judicial formality while also accommodating the unique challenges posed by supernatural crimes that could not be proven through conventional evidence. The dramatic courtroom scenes that resulted from the afflicted girls' reactions to the presence of accused witches created a theatrical environment that reinforced beliefs about supernatural conflict while also providing seemingly objective demonstration of the accused person's guilt. Bridget Bishop's execution on June 10, 1692, represented the first judicial killing in the Salem Witch Trials and established the court's willingness to impose capital punishment for witchcraft convictions. Her death sent a clear message to the community that the authorities were serious about eliminating supernatural threats while also demonstrating the ultimate consequences that awaited those found guilty of practicing witchcraft. The expansion of the court's activities following Bishop's execution reflected both the increasing number of accusations being made throughout Massachusetts and the authorities' growing confidence in their ability to identify and prosecute supernatural criminals effectively. The court's systematic approach to processing cases created an efficient system for handling witchcraft prosecutions, while also building momentum that made additional accusations and prosecutions seem logical and necessary. Here's something that shows how legal systems can be corrupted by fear and political pressure. From which country are you watching this? Because history contains many examples of courts abandoning normal procedures and evidence standards when dealing with crimes that generate strong public emotion or political pressure. What examples can you think of from your region where legal systems failed to protect individual rights during times of crisis? Share your insights in the comments. The development of confession as a strategy for avoiding execution created a perverse incentive system that encouraged accused individuals to admit guilt for crimes they had not committed while also providing additional evidence that supported the court's belief in the reality and extent of the witchcraft conspiracy. Those who confessed and implicated others were spared execution, while those who maintained their innocence were more likely to be convicted and executed. The role of local ministers and theological authorities in supporting the court's work provided religious legitimacy for the witch trials, while also creating intellectual frameworks that justified the use of spectral evidence and other controversial prosecution techniques. The involvement of respected religious figures like Cotton Mather gave the trials credibility with devout community members while also providing theological arguments that made opposition to the proceedings seem equivalent to supporting Satan and supernatural evil. The social patterns that emerged in the court's prosecution decisions revealed how existing community conflicts and power relationships influenced who was accused, who was believed, and who was ultimately convicted and executed. The trial served as a mechanism for settling old scores and advancing factional interests while also providing a socially acceptable outlet for community tensions that might otherwise have resulted in open conflict or violence. The geographic expansion of the court's jurisdiction beyond Salem to include cases from Andover, Ipswich, and other communities demonstrated how the witch hunting phenomenon could spread rapidly once it gained official support and institutional momentum. The involvement of multiple communities also revealed how local conflicts and grievances could be channeled through the witchcraft prosecution system to achieve results that would have been impossible through normal legal procedures. The economic impact of the witch trials on accused individuals and their families was severe, as prosecution for witchcraft typically resulted in property confiscation, social ostracism, and economic ruin even for those who ultimately escaped execution. The financial incentives created by property seizure also provided additional motivation for accusations against wealthy individuals whose assets could benefit accusers and court officials. The psychological atmosphere created by the court's activities generated widespread fear and suspicion that affected entire communities and made normal social relationships increasingly difficult to maintain. The knowledge that anyone could be accused of witchcraft based on spectral evidence and supernatural testimony created an environment of mutual distrust that would have lasting effects on Massachusetts society even after the trials ended. The international attention attracted by the Salem Witch Trials reflected both the unusual scope and legal character of the Massachusetts prosecutions and the broader European interest in witchcraft and supernatural crime that characterized the early modern period. The trials occurred at a time when witch hunting was declining in Europe, making the Massachusetts experience seem both anachronistic and particularly noteworthy to contemporary observers. The expansion of witchcraft accusations beyond the original core group in Salem Village to encompass dozens of individuals across multiple Massachusetts communities demonstrates how mass hysteria can spread rapidly through social networks when favorable conditions exist and institutional authorities provide validation and support for supernatural explanations of unusual events. The geographic and demographic expansion of the trials reveals the complex social, psychological, and political factors that allowed a localized crisis to become a regional catastrophe that would ultimately claim 25 lives and destroy countless others. The spread of accusations to Andover, Massachusetts, beginning in July 1692, marked a significant escalation in the scope and intensity of the witch-hunting phenomenon as an entire community became consumed by fears of supernatural conspiracy and demonic infiltration. The Andover cases began when Martha Carrier, a local woman with a reputation for argumentative behavior and nonconformity, was accused of witchcraft and subsequently implicated dozens of other community members in an expanding web of supernatural criminality that eventually encompassed entire families and social networks. The role of visiting afflicted girls from Salem in triggering the Andover outbreak reveals how the witch-hunting phenomenon could be deliberately exported from one community to another through the activities of individuals who had gained special authority and status as supernatural witnesses. The girls' ability to identify witches in communities where they had no previous knowledge or personal connections suggested either genuine supernatural insight or the operation of suggestion and coaching that allowed them to make accusations that would serve the interests of local political and social factions. The family-based pattern of accusations that characterized the Andover cases demonstrates how kinship networks could either provide protection against witchcraft charges or make entire family groups vulnerable to mass accusation once one member was suspected of supernatural criminality. The targeting of the Carrier family, the Parker family, and other extended family groups suggests that witchcraft accusations followed existing social relationships and could be used to eliminate entire kinship networks that posed political or economic threats to dominant community factions. The confession phenomenon that reached its peak during the Andover phase of the trials created a psychological and legal dynamic that encouraged accused individuals to admit guilt for crimes they had not committed, while also providing detailed testimony about supernatural activities and accomplices that validated the court's belief in an extensive witchcraft conspiracy. The confessions provided by Andover residents were often elaborate and detailed, describing meetings with the devil, supernatural flights to distant locations, and participation in rituals designed to harm community members and destroy the Puritan religious mission. The social class patterns that emerged in the Andover accusations reveal important insights into how economic inequality and social tension contributed to the witch-hunting phenomenon, as accusations tended to flow from lower-status individuals toward those of higher social and economic standing, suggesting that witchcraft charges could serve as weapons for challenging established hierarchies and settling grievances related to economic exploitation and social exclusion. The role of children and adolescents as both accusers and accused in the Andover cases highlights the particular vulnerability of young people to the psychological pressures and social dynamics that drove the witch-hunting phenomenon. Many Andover confessions came from teenagers and young adults who may have been especially susceptible to suggestion and coercion, while also lacking the social authority and life experience necessary to resist the enormous pressure to admit guilt and implicate others. The gender dimensions of the Andover accusations reflect broader patterns in the Salem witch trials, while also revealing specific aspects of how accusations of supernatural criminality could be used to challenge or reinforce existing power relationships between men and women in Puritan society. While women comprised the majority of both accusers and accused throughout the trials, the Andover cases included significant numbers of male accused individuals, suggesting that the witch-hunting phenomenon had evolved beyond its initial focus on female supernatural criminality. Here's something that shows how mass hysteria can consume entire communities. From which country are you watching this? Because throughout history, communities have experienced episodes where fear and suspicion spread rapidly through social networks, often targeting marginalized groups or individuals. What examples can you think of from your region where mass hysteria or moral panic affected entire communities? Share your observations in the comments. The involvement of respectable, wealthy, and politically prominent individuals among the Andover accused marked a significant shift in the social dynamics of the witch trials, as accusations began to threaten members of the colonial elite, who possessed the social connections and political influence necessary to challenge the court's procedures and assumptions. The inclusion of individuals like Dudley Bradstreet and other members of prominent families created opposition to the trials that would eventually contribute to their termination. The administrative challenges created by the massive number of accusations and arrests in Andover and other communities strained the colonial justice system and created logistical problems that made effective prosecution increasingly difficult. The jails became overcrowded with accused witches awaiting trial, while the costs of maintaining so many prisoners created financial burdens that affected the colonial government's ability to continue the prosecution campaign indefinitely. The religious controversy generated by the expansion of accusations to include church members, ministers' relatives, and other individuals whose piety and moral character had been previously unquestioned created theological and practical problems for Puritan authorities who had initially supported the trials as necessary spiritual warfare against Satan's assault on their godly community. The inclusion of obviously pious individuals among the accused forced community leaders to reconsider their assumptions about the relationship between moral character and susceptibility to supernatural corruption. The economic disruption caused by the massive number of arrests and property seizures associated with the Andover cases affected entire communities and created additional incentives for opposition to the trials, as families and business networks found their normal activities interrupted by the imprisonment of family members and the confiscation of property belonging to accused individuals. The economic costs of the witch trials began to outweigh their perceived benefits for community protection and moral purification. The development of organized opposition to the trials began during the Andover phase as prominent individuals whose family members or business associates had been accused started to question the court's procedures and evidentiary standards, creating political pressure for reform or termination of the prosecutions. This opposition included both secular and religious authorities who had initially supported the trials, but became concerned about their expanding scope and apparent targeting of respectable community members. The psychological toll of the extended witch-hunting campaign on both accusers and accused became increasingly evident as the Andover cases proceeded, with many individuals showing signs of emotional exhaustion, depression, and trauma that affected their ability to participate effectively in the legal proceedings. The sustained intensity of fear and suspicion required to maintain the witch-hunting phenomenon was difficult to sustain over extended periods, creating psychological conditions that favored eventual termination of the trials. The documentation challenges created by the massive number of Andover cases strained the court's ability to maintain detailed records and conduct thorough investigations, leading to increasingly perfunctory proceedings that relied more heavily on confessions and spectral evidence while providing less careful evaluation of individual circumstances and evidence. This procedural deterioration contributed to growing concerns about the fairness and reliability of the trial process. The communication networks that spread information about the Andover cases throughout Massachusetts and beyond created awareness of the scope and intensity of the witch-hunting phenomenon that generated both support and opposition from observers in other communities who used the Massachusetts experience to evaluate their own approaches to supernatural crime and community protection against demonic infiltration. The emergence of opposition to the Salem Witch Trials during the summer and fall of 1692 represented a crucial turning point that would eventually lead to the termination of the prosecutions and the recognition that a terrible miscarriage of justice had occurred. This opposition came from various quarters of Massachusetts society, including religious leaders, legal authorities, and ordinary citizens who began to question the court's procedures, evidence standards, and basic assumptions about the reality and scope of the supposed witchcraft conspiracy that had justified the executions of 20 people and the imprisonment of hundreds more. The emergence of opposition to the Salem Witch Trials during the summer and fall of 1692 represented a crucial turning point that would eventually lead to the termination of the prosecutions and the recognition that a terrible miscarriage of justice had occurred. This opposition came from various quarters of Massachusetts society, including religious leaders, legal authorities, and ordinary citizens who began to question the court's procedures, evidence standards, and basic assumptions about the reality and scope of the supposed witchcraft conspiracy that had justified the executions of 20 people and the imprisonment of hundreds more. The theological criticism of the trial's reliance on spectral evidence emerged primarily from educated Puritan ministers who understood both the legal and spiritual implications of accepting supernatural testimony as valid evidence in criminal proceedings. Leading theologians like Increase Mather and his son Cotton Mather, who had initially supported the trials, began to develop sophisticated arguments about the unreliability of spectral evidence and the possibility that Satan could appear in the shape of innocent persons to deceive witnesses and corrupt judicial proceedings. Increase Mather's influential treatise, Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits Personating Men, presented the most systematic theological critique of the trial's evidentiary standards, arguing that the court's acceptance of spectral evidence violated fundamental principles of both divine justice and human legal procedure. Mather's position that it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned became a rallying cry for opponents of the trials and provided theological justification for demanding higher standards of evidence in witchcraft cases. The legal criticism of the Court of Oyer and Terminer focused on its departure from established English common law procedures and its acceptance of evidence types that would not be permitted in normal criminal proceedings. Legal authorities both within Massachusetts and in England expressed concern about the court's willingness to convict individuals based primarily on spectral evidence and the testimony of afflicted witnesses whose credibility could not be independently verified through conventional means. The role of Thomas Brattle, a prominent Boston merchant and intellectual, in organizing opposition to the trials demonstrated how educated laypeople could contribute to the growing critique of the court's procedures and assumptions. Brattle's famous letter of October 1692 provided a detailed and devastating analysis of the trial's logical inconsistencies, procedural irregularities, and obvious injustices that would prove influential in convincing colonial authorities to reconsider their approach to witchcraft prosecution. The emergence of alternative explanations for the afflicted girl's behavior represented a crucial development in the opposition to the trials, as critics began to suggest that the mysterious symptoms that had triggered the entire crisis might be caused by natural rather than supernatural factors. These alternative explanations included various forms of fraud, psychological disorder, and medical conditions that could account for the girl's dramatic behaviors without requiring belief in witchcraft or demonic possession. The political pressure that developed against the trials reflected growing concern among colonial leaders that the prosecutions were damaging Massachusetts's reputation and threatening its political relationship with England, particularly as the trials began to target prominent and well-connected individuals whose execution or continued imprisonment could create diplomatic and political problems for the colonial government. The involvement of influential families in the accusations created powerful enemies of the court, who possessed the political resources necessary to challenge its authority and procedures. Here's something that shows how intellectual courage can help end injustice. From which country are you watching this? Because throughout history it has often taken brave individuals willing to challenge popular beliefs and powerful institutions to stop persecution and restore justice. What examples can you think of from your region where intellectuals, religious leaders, or other respected figures stood up against mass hysteria or judicial abuse? Share your thoughts in the comments. The growing skepticism about the reality of the witchcraft conspiracy reflected both the expansion of accusations to include obviously innocent and respectable individuals, and the increasing recognition that the confessions extracted from accused persons were unreliable and often contradictory. As more people confessed to avoid execution and provided detailed but inconsistent accounts of supernatural activities, observers began to question whether these confessions reflected genuine supernatural experiences or desperate attempts to escape death through false admissions of guilt. The role of family members and friends of accused individuals in organizing opposition to the trials created a network of motivated critics who had personal stakes in challenging the court's procedures and assumptions. These individuals possessed detailed knowledge of the accused person's characters and activities that contradicted the supernatural narratives presented in court, while also having strong emotional and practical incentives to fight against prosecutions that threatened their loved ones with execution and their families with social and economic ruin. The changing international context that affected Massachusetts during 1692 also contributed to growing opposition to the trials, as the colony's new royal charter required greater religious tolerance and legal conformity with English standards that were increasingly skeptical of witchcraft prosecutions. The need to demonstrate colonial competence and adherence to English legal norms made the continuation of trials based on spectral evidence and supernatural testimony increasingly problematic for colonial authorities seeking to maintain good relationships with royal officials. The economic costs of maintaining the extensive prosecution campaign began to outweigh its perceived benefits as the trials dragged on and affected increasing numbers of individuals whose imprisonment and property confiscation disrupted normal economic activities and created financial burdens for the colonial government. The practical difficulties of housing and feeding hundreds of accused individuals, while also conducting complex legal proceedings, strained colonial resources and created additional incentives for ending the prosecutions. The psychological exhaustion that affected many participants in the trials, including the afflicted girls, court officials, and community members, contributed to declining enthusiasm for continued prosecutions as the emotional intensity required to maintain belief in an extensive witchcraft conspiracy became increasingly difficult to sustain over extended periods. The dramatic courtroom scenes that had initially provided compelling evidence of supernatural activity began to seem repetitive and less convincing as they continued month after month. The influence of educated outsiders who observed the trials and provided critical perspectives that local participants might have been unable to develop independently played an important role in creating opposition to the prosecutions. Visitors from other colonies and countries, along with correspondents who learned about the trials through letters and reports, provided external validation for critics who questioned the trial's procedures and assumptions. The development of organized political opposition to Chief Justice William Stoughton and the Court of Oyer and Terminer reflected growing recognition that the judicial system had failed in its fundamental responsibility to protect innocent individuals from false conviction and execution. This political opposition would eventually lead to the replacement of the special court with a new judicial system that would apply more stringent evidentiary standards to witchcraft cases. The moral and religious crisis created by the recognition that innocent people had been executed for crimes they had not committed forced Massachusetts authorities and citizens to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between religious enthusiasm and judicial procedure, the reliability of supernatural testimony, and the dangers of allowing fear and hysteria to override careful legal analysis and protection of individual rights. The termination of the Salem Witch Trials in October 1692 marked not only the end of a judicial catastrophe that had claimed 25 lives, but also the beginning of a painful process of recognition, repentance, and historical reckoning that would force Massachusetts society to confront the terrible consequences of allowing fear and superstition to override reason and justice. The factors that led to the trial's end were as complex as those that had caused their beginning, reflecting changing political circumstances, growing intellectual opposition, and the simple exhaustion of a community that could no longer sustain the emotional intensity required for continued witch hunting, Governor William Phipps's decision to dissolve the Court of Oyer and Terminer and prohibit further imprisonments for witchcraft reflected both political pressure from influential colonists whose relatives had been accused and practical recognition that the trials had spiraled beyond any reasonable proportion to the original concerns about supernatural threats to community safety. Phipps's action represented a decisive intervention by executive authority to stop judicial proceedings that had lost public support and were threatening the colony's political stability and international reputation. The establishment of the Superior Court of Judicature in January 1693 to replace the discredited Court of Oyer and Terminer represented an attempt to restore normal legal procedures while also addressing the backlog of witchcraft cases that remained from the previous year's prosecutions. The new court, while still legally empowered to try witchcraft cases, applied much more stringent evidentiary standards that effectively ended the possibility of convictions based primarily on spectral evidence and the testimony of afflicted witnesses. The dramatic change in conviction rates under the new court system demonstrated how crucial the acceptance of spectral evidence had been to the success of the previous year's prosecutions, as only 3 of the 56 remaining defendants were convicted when normal legal standards were applied to their cases. Governor Phipps's decision to reprieve even these few convictions and release all remaining prisoners effectively ended witchcraft prosecutions in Massachusetts and established precedents that would prevent future witch hunting campaigns. The process of releasing the imprisoned accused individuals created logistical and financial challenges for colonial authorities, as many of the prisoners lacked the resources necessary to pay their jail fees and support themselves after months or years of incarceration had destroyed their economic circumstances and social relationships. The requirement that prisoners pay for their own imprisonment created additional injustices for individuals who had been wrongly accused and were now being penalized financially for their false imprisonment. To the public recantations issued by some of the afflicted girls and other participants in the trials represented crucial admissions that the supernatural experiences and testimony that had justified the prosecutions had been either false or misinterpreted, though these recantations came too late to save the lives of those who had already been executed. Ann Putnam Jr.'s public apology in 1706, in which he acknowledged being deluded by Satan into making false accusations, provided one of the most significant acknowledgments of error from the original accusers. The official day of fasting and soul-searching proclaimed by the Massachusetts General Court in 1697 represented the colonial government's formal acknowledgement that the witch trials had been a mistake that required public repentance and divine forgiveness, while also establishing a precedent for governmental admission of error that was unusual in early American political culture. The day of fasting provided a framework for community processing of guilt and trauma, while also attempting to restore moral legitimacy to colonial institutions. The compensation provided to the families of executed victims and other survivors of the trials represented an early example of governmental reparations for judicial error, though the amounts provided were generally inadequate to repair the economic and social damage that had been inflicted on the victims and their families. The compensation process also required victims' families to petition for redress and prove their innocence, creating additional burdens for people who had already suffered greatly from false accusations. Here's something that shows how societies can acknowledge and attempt to repair historical injustices. From which country are you watching this? Because the process of recognizing, apologizing for, and providing reparations for historical wrongs has become an important aspect of modern justice, though it was unusual in the 17th century. What examples can you think of from your region where governments or institutions have acknowledged and tried to repair historical injustices? Share your insights in the comments. The long-term impact of the Salem Witch Trials on Massachusetts society and American legal culture was profound and lasting, as the trials became a symbol of the dangers of judicial corruption, mass hysteria, and the importance of protecting individual rights against mob rule and governmental overreach. The phrase witch hunt entered common usage as a metaphor for unfair persecution based on unfounded accusations and insufficient evidence, while the trials themselves became a cautionary tale about the fragility of justice and the need for constant vigilance. against the abuse of governmental power. The intellectual legacy of the trials included important developments in legal procedure, evidence evaluation, and the relationship between religious belief and secular governance that would influence American legal and political development for centuries. The recognition that religious enthusiasm and supernatural beliefs could corrupt judicial proceedings contributed to growing support for the separation of church and state and the development of secular legal institutions that could provide impartial justice regardless of religious considerations. The historical memory of the Salem Witch Trials evolved significantly over time, with different generations interpreting the events according to their own cultural concerns and political perspectives, while also using the trials as a lens for examining broader questions about American identity, religious freedom, and the protection of minority rights against majority persecution. The trials became a founding myth of American civil liberties that emphasized the importance of due process and individual rights protection. The literary and cultural influence of the Salem Witch Trials extended far beyond their immediate historical significance, inspiring works of literature, theater, and art that used the trials as subject matter for exploring universal themes about human nature, social conformity, political corruption, and moral courage under pressure. Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, became the most famous artistic interpretation of the trials, using the 1692 events to comment on McCarthyism and political persecution in 1950s America. The ongoing archaeological and historical research about the Salem Witch Trials continues to reveal new information about the events of 1692 and their broader social and cultural contexts, while also demonstrating how historical interpretation can change as new evidence becomes available and different analytical approaches are applied to familiar materials. The discovery of the actual execution site and other archaeological findings have provided physical evidence that complements and sometimes contradicts traditional historical narratives. The educational use of the Salem Witch Trials in American schools and universities has made the events of 1692 among the most familiar episodes in American colonial history, while also creating opportunities for teaching about historical methodology, primary source analysis, and the importance of critical thinking in evaluating historical claims and contemporary political accusations. The trials serve as an accessible case study for exploring complex historical causation and the relationship between individual agency and social forces. The contemporary relevance of the Salem Witch Trials continues to be invoked in discussions about mass hysteria, false accusations, social media persecution, and other forms of collective behavior that can threaten individual rights and social justice, demonstrating how historical events can provide frameworks for understanding and responding to current challenges. The trials remain a powerful reminder of how quickly rational discourse can be overwhelmed by fear, hatred, and the human tendency to scapegoat marginalized individuals and groups during times of social stress and uncertainty. As we step back from the shadows of Salem's tragedy and the gallows that claimed 20 innocent lives, we're left with a story that serves as one of the most powerful warnings in American history about what happens when fear overwhelms reason, when authority abandons justice, and when communities turn against their own members in pursuit of imaginary enemies. We've discovered that the Salem Witch Trials were never really about witchcraft at all, but about the complex social tensions, political rivalries, and psychological pressures that can tear communities apart when people lose faith in rational discourse and due process. The real horror of Salem wasn't supernatural, it was entirely human, revealing the capacity for ordinary people to become both victims and perpetrators in cycles of accusation and persecution that destroy everything they claim to protect. The legacy of Salem reminds us that the institutions we depend on to protect justice and individual rights are fragile and require constant vigilance to maintain. The transformation of